I want you to imagine the feeling of metal clicking around your wrist in the driveway of your own home. Not in a back alley, not during a traffic stop at 2 in the morning. In your own driveway, in broad daylight, on a Tuesday afternoon that started out warm and quiet and smelled like engine oil and cut grass. The kind of afternoon I used to dream about when I was 18,000 feet above sea level in a country most people couldn't point to on a map. That is where this story starts. My name is Mara Calloway. I am 27 years old. And before I tell you what happened on Birchwood Lane, I need you to understand something about who I was on that day, because it matters. It matters more than anything else I'm going to say. I spent 5 years inside a unit that, as of the day I enlisted, did not officially exist. You will not find my deployment records in any public database. You will not find the names of the operations I was part of in any news archive. For 5 years, I was a ghost. And that was the job. That was the point. I went places that required no paperwork and left no trace. I worked alongside people who were brilliant and fearless and completely invisible to the world, and we did things that I cannot describe here. Things that kept certain people alive and certain other people from ever hurting anyone again. I was good at it. I was very, very good at it. But by the time I was 26, I had been shot at in 4 countries, had shrapnel pulled from my side in a field hospital, and had watched 2 people I considered brothers not come home from a ridgeline in Paktia province. And I realized, sitting in a debrief room that smelled like stale coffee and recycled air, that I was tired in a way that no amount of leave was going to fix. So I did something I never thought I would do. I put in my discharge papers. I signed the paperwork. I shook the hands I needed to shake. And then I drove away from the base with a single duffel bag in the back seat and absolutely no plan for what came next. I found Cedarwood Hills on a rental website. It was everything I had never had growing up. A quiet suburb, wide streets, big trees that threw shade in the right places, and a general hum of ordinary life that I found almost unbearable in its beauty. 318 Birchwood Lane was a 2-story colonial with a 2-car garage, a driveway that could fit 4 vehicles, and a backyard with a fence high enough to give me privacy. I signed a 6-month lease in April. I moved in on a Saturday. By Sunday, I had the garage organized and the Mustang on jack stands. The car, a 1967 Ford Mustang Fastback in faded Highland green, had been sitting in a storage unit in Virginia for 2 years, bought off an estate sale, with the last of a bonus I'd never spent. She was rough. The body had rust along the rocker panels. The interior was shot. The engine ran, barely, but with the kind of reluctant growl that told you it was running on stubbornness more than anything mechanical. She needed work. Serious, patient, methodical work. Perfect. That's what I needed too. Fixing things that I could see and touch and measure. That was my therapy. I had no interest in talking to anyone about Paktia. I had no interest in group sessions or breathing exercises or whatever it is they hand you along with the discharge papers and a pamphlet about veteran resources. I wanted to put my hands on something broken and make it whole again. That was all. I had been in Cedarwood Hills for 2 months when it happened. It was a Tuesday in late June. The temperature was sitting just below 90, and I had the garage door open to catch whatever breeze was moving. I had spent the morning pulling the old carburetor and had started work on the distributor by early afternoon. I was wearing a tank top, a pair of old cargos, and my work boots. Heavy steel-toed things I'd had since my second deployment. My hands were black with grease up to the elbows. I was listening to a playlist I'd made for long stretches of work, mostly old soul, Otis Redding, Wilson Pickett, a little Etta James. And I was in that focused, meditative state that only happens when you're doing something technical with your hands and your whole brain is just quiet. For the first time in longer than I could remember, I felt like myself. Not a veteran, not a ghost, just a woman working on her car on a summer afternoon. Across the street, behind a curtain I had noticed on my first week but never given much thought to, Margaret Dunmore was watching. I knew who she was. I had introduced myself when I first moved in, walked over with a tin of cookies I'd picked up from the bakery 2 blocks away, knocked, said hello. She had opened the door about 8 inches, looked me up and down, with a look I recognized immediately, even though I'd spent most of my life learning to ignore it, and told me she was busy. I said it was nice to meet her. I meant it. I went home. I don't know exactly what Peggy Dunmore told herself as she watched me work that afternoon. I don't know what story she built around the image of a black woman with grease on her hands and a tattoo on her forearm bent over the engine of a car in that driveway. Maybe she told herself she was being careful. Maybe she told herself she was looking out for the neighborhood. Maybe she didn't examine the story at all. Maybe it was just a reflex, fast and automatic and completely unseen, like breathing. But she picked up her phone and she called 911. "There's a woman," she said, "and I know this because I later got the recording. She looks like she's breaking into the car. The Henderson used to own that house. I don't think she lives there. She doesn't look like she lives there. She looks aggressive." Aggressive. I was humming Otis Redding and torquing a distributor bolt. A mile and a half away, Officer Cassidy Vance received a dispatch. Suspicious person, possible break-in, 318 Birchwood Lane. Vance was 24 years old. She had been on the force for 18 months. She had the kind of confidence that comes not from experience, but from the absence of anyone ever telling you no. The posture of someone who had always found that the world arranged itself around her preferences. She turned off her sirens before she turned onto Birchwood Lane. She liked arriving before people expected her. She liked the advantage of surprise. I felt the car before I heard it. There is a particular awareness that develops after years of operating in environments where the wrong kind of footstep at the wrong moment means something catastrophic. A sensitivity to changes in the air, to the presence of bodies in spaces you thought were clear. I was reaching for a socket wrench when the sensation hit the back of my neck, cold and precise, like a fingertip pressing against the skin. I did not look up immediately. I set the wrench down on the cloth I had laid over the fender to protect the paint. I straightened slowly, and then I turned. The patrol car had pulled into the far end of the driveway. The door was already open. Officer Vance was already walking toward me, one hand resting on her belt, eyes moving over me the way a scanner moves over a barcode, looking for the information that would confirm what she had already decided. She did not say good afternoon. She did not introduce herself. "Step away from the vehicle," she said. Her voice was practiced, the flat, controlled tone of someone who had rehearsed authority without ever being tested on it. There was something underneath it, though, something that sounded like excitement, like she had been waiting for a reason to use that voice. I stepped back from the Mustang and turned to face her fully, hands at my sides, palms open. That was deliberate. It is the body language of someone who is not a threat, and it is the body language of someone who knows exactly what they are doing. I had been in rooms with people who wanted to use me as an excuse. I knew how to deny them the excuse. "Good afternoon, officer," I said. My voice was level. My heart was level. "Is there something I can help you with?" She stopped about 10 feet from me. Her eyes traveled down to my boots, then back up to my face. They lingered on the tattoo on my forearm, a spear design, angular and deliberate, that I had gotten after my second deployment. In her eyes, I could see the calculation happening, and I knew what answer it arrived at. In her world, a woman who looked like me, with ink on her arm and grease on her hands in a neighborhood like this one, had a story that fit neatly into a very specific file. That file was wrong. "This your car?" she asked. "Yes, ma'am." "You live here?" "I do. I'm renting. I've been here since April." She looked at the house. She looked at the Mustang. She looked back at me. And I could see in the small shift around her eyes that the math wasn't working for her. But instead of adjusting the equation, she was adjusting the evidence. "I'm going to need to see some ID," she said. "My ID is inside. I can go get it, or I can give you my name and you can run the property records right now. They'll show Mara Calloway, the leaseholder, at this address." "Don't tell me how to do my job," she said, and her voice dropped about half an octave, the shift that happens when someone decides they've been patient long enough. "ID now." I did not move toward the door. I looked at her steadily. "I am happy to cooperate," I said. "I need you to understand that I live here. I am working on my own car. I am not trespassing, and I am not committing any crime. If you run the plates on that truck," I nodded toward my black F-150 parked at the edge of the driveway, "they will come back to me at this address." She pulled her radio off her belt, called in the plates, waited. 30 seconds later, the confirmation came back. Mara Calloway, 318 Birchwood Lane. The look on her face did something interesting when she heard that. It didn't soften. It hardened. The way a person's face hardens when they realize they've walked out onto a limb and someone has pointed it out, and now they have to decide whether to keep going or turn back. Vance kept going. I still need to see ID, she said. I could hear something else now. Down the block, 2 houses to my left, a window was open. I didn't look directly at it, but in my peripheral vision, I registered the small rectangle of a phone screen catching the afternoon light. Jordan? I knew his name because his grandmother had introduced us once while she was gardening. Had his camera pointed at us. Good. Officer, I said carefully, there's a camera mounted on my porch. There is a camera on your patrol car. I'm telling you this not as a threat, but as information. I'm telling you that whatever happens in this driveway is being recorded, and I'd like both of us to be thoughtful about that. Something moved behind her eyes, not caution, not hesitation, something closer to anger. Turn around, she said. I beg your pardon? Turn around and put your hands on the vehicle. I felt the world go very quiet. It is the same quiet I feel before a decision point in the field, when everything compresses down to a single breath and you understand that what happens next will depend entirely on what you choose to do in the next half second. I thought about what I could do. The answer came quickly and without effort, the way it always does, because that is what training does. It makes the calculation automatic. I could remove the threat in under 2 seconds. I could have her on the ground with her radio out of reach before she registered the movement. I knew exactly how to do it and exactly how little force it would require. And then I thought about what that would cost me. The whole story that would get written. The narrative that would take the next 30 seconds and replace everything else. Everything I was, everything I had done, everything I had survived. With a single headline. I had spent 5 years being invisible. I was not going to become visible in that particular way. Okay, I said quietly. You are making a mistake, Officer Vance, a serious one. I need you to know that. Last warning, she said. I turned. I placed my hands on the fender, and even through the burn of everything I was feeling, I registered the slight scratch of metal against paint. The tiny ding on the edge of a restoration I had been building piece by piece for 2 months. That somehow was what made it real. The handcuffs were not gentle. She jerked my wrists together at an angle that was designed to cause discomfort. A technique meant to make a person flinch, to get them to pull away, to give her a reason to escalate further. My shoulders are built from years of carrying weight in impossible terrain. I didn't flinch. I exhaled and widened my stance slightly to absorb the pressure, and I said nothing. You're being detained, she said, for trespassing and failure to comply with a lawful order. I almost said something. I stopped myself. I let her walk me down the driveway and open the back door of the patrol car and guide me in by the shoulder. The seat was hard plastic and smelled of industrial cleaner and old fear. The door slammed behind me. Through the scratched rear window, I looked back at 318 Birchwood Lane. The Mustang sat in the driveway, hood still open. My tools were scattered on the drop cloth. The socket wrench I had been holding when this started was still lying on the fender, right where I'd left it, everything I had been building, just sitting there. The engine of the patrol car started, and Cassidy Vance pulled out into the street without looking back. I closed my eyes. I had 2 assets she didn't know about, a number I had memorized years ago that connected directly to the Pentagon, and a mind that was already quietly and methodically constructing what was going to happen next. She thought she was in control of this situation. She wasn't. She hadn't been since the moment she stepped out of that car. I leaned my head back against the seat. Outside, through the window, Birchwood Lane slid past. The wide trees, the careful lawns, the ordinary summer afternoon that had just become the worst decision Officer Cassidy Vance ever made. And then I got to work. If you've ever been told you don't belong somewhere you had every right to be, drop a comment below and let us know where you're watching from. And if you want to know what happened when I walked into that police station with nothing but a phone number and a plan, stay right here. The story is just getting started. Subscribe so you don't miss part 2. There is a specific kind of silence that lives inside police stations. It is not peaceful. It is not empty. It is the silence of a place where people are waiting for something to be decided about them, and where the people doing the deciding are in no particular hurry. It presses against your ears like water pressure at depth. You become aware of sounds you would never notice anywhere else. A stapler somewhere in the back, a chair rolling across tile, A phone ringing twice and stopping, the hum of fluorescent lights, the distant bark of someone being processed in a room you cannot see. I sat on a bench bolted to the wall in the processing area of the Cedarwood Hills Police Department, wrists still cuffed behind my back, and I listened. The station was small, the kind that gets built in the 70s with just enough room to feel institutional, not enough to feel serious. The walls were painted a beige that had been chosen by someone who believed beige communicated authority. A bulletin board near the front desk was layered in overlapping papers. A community watch flyer on top of a lost dog poster, on top of a fire safety notice from 2 years ago. The desk officer had looked at me once when Vance walked me in, then looked back at her screen without expression. That was all the acknowledgement I received. Vance had not said another word to me in the car. She had pulled into the lot, killed the engine, and walked around to open the door with the posture of someone completing a transaction. When she reached in to pull me out by the arm, I stood on my own. She didn't like that. People who mistake compliance for helplessness always get irritated when you demonstrate the difference. Now she was somewhere in the back, out of sight. I could hear her voice occasionally. The higher register she slipped into when she was explaining herself, the slight clip of someone who needs other people to agree with her in order to feel stable. I had known people like that in the field. They were the ones you watched most carefully, not because they were the most dangerous, but because they were the most unpredictable. Competent people are dangerous in straight lines. Insecure people are dangerous in spirals. I had been sitting for maybe 20 minutes when the door to the back offices swung open. Captain Lloyd Briggs was exactly the kind of man you'd expect to find running a department in a suburb that prided itself on property values and low crime statistics. 52, thick through the chest and shoulders in the way of someone who used to be athletic and now just carries the frame. His uniform was crisp, which told me he cared about how things looked. His handshake, which he offered before he even sat down, like this was a business meeting, was firm but practiced. The handshake of a man who'd read somewhere that a firm handshake communicates authority. "Miss Calloway," he said, pulling a chair over and sitting across from me at an angle, not directly in front of me, which would have been confrontational, but not beside me either, which would have been too casual. He'd chosen the diplomatic diagonal. "I apologize for the wait. I'm Captain Briggs. I want you to know that I've reviewed the situation, and I think we can get this cleared up very quickly." His voice was warm. That was the thing that hit me first. Not aggressive, not dismissive, warm. The voice of a man who had spent years learning how to make people feel like they were being heard at exactly the moment he was deciding to ignore them. I looked at him. I didn't say anything yet. "Officer Vance responded to a call," he continued, leaning forward slightly, elbows on his knees. "And situations like these, they happen. Communication breaks down. Things escalate faster than anyone intends. I want to assure you that is not how this department operates on a normal basis." He paused. "We'd like to release you today. No charges filed, no record of the incident. You go home, we all move forward. How does that sound?" I let the silence hold for a moment. In a room like that, silence makes people nervous. It made Briggs shift almost imperceptibly in his chair. "What happens to Officer Vance?" I asked. Something moved through his expression, quick, like a cloud shadow crossing open ground. He covered it smoothly. "She'll receive a formal reprimand in her file," he said, "and we'll put her through a refresher course on community engagement protocol. We take these things seriously, Miss Calloway." "A refresher course. That's correct." I took a slow breath. I thought about the angle of those handcuffs. I thought about the sound my hands had made when Vance pressed them against the Mustang's fender. I thought about the practiced way she had escalated, not out of panic, but out of habit. That was what told me everything I needed to know about Lloyd Briggs and the department he ran. What Vance had done in that driveway, she had done before. Probably many times. The only thing unusual about today was that she'd done it to the wrong person. "I don't accept your offer, Captain," I said. His warmth flickered, but only at the edges. "Miss Calloway, I'd like my phone." A beat. "Excuse me?" "My personal property was confiscated during booking. That includes my phone. Under the Fourth Amendment, you cannot continue to hold my personal effects without charge. I'm not charged with anything. I'd like my phone." He studied me for a moment with the careful eyes of a man recalculating. He had come in here expecting someone who was scared or angry or both, someone he could manage. He was finding something else. I watched him decide that returning the phone was easier than the argument, and he stepped out to get it. When he came back and then placed it in front of me, still cuffed, I looked at him. Could you remove the restraints? I can't use the phone with my hands behind my back. Another pause, another calculation. He nodded to the desk officer who came over with a key. I sat quietly while the cuffs came off. I rolled my wrists once, picked up the phone, navigated to a contact that had no name attached to it, just a string of digits I had committed to memory years ago during a briefing in a basement in Virginia. Because you don't write down the number for the Pentagon's Judge Advocate General Corps. You remember it, and you hope you never need it. I called it. Briggs had already started to stand, assuming the call was to a friend or a local attorney. He glanced at the desk officer. He was preparing to leave the room. The call connected on the second ring. JAG Operations, Colonel Stokes. The name landed in the room the way a stone lands in still water. Not loud, but felt everywhere at once. I saw Briggs stop moving. Colonel, I said, keeping my voice even and professional. This is Sergeant Calloway. I've got a situation I need you to be aware of. There was a half-second pause on the line, the kind that comes from someone recalibrating very quickly. Mara, where are you? Cedarwood Hills Police Department, ma'am. I was taken into custody at my home address approximately 2 hours ago. Unlawful arrest, forced detention. During the stop, my federal identification was handled by an officer who has no clearance to touch it. The silence that followed was short. It was the silence of someone doing math. Your Kestrel card? Yes, ma'am. Understood. Is the commanding officer present? I looked at Briggs, who had not moved. His face had gone through 3 different colors in the last 15 seconds and had landed for the moment on something that looked like the beginning of genuine fear. He's right here, I said. Would you like to speak with him? Put him on. I held the phone out to Briggs. He took it like a man accepting something he'd rather not hold. Captain Briggs? He said, still trying to sound in control. I watched him listen. I could not hear what Dinah Stokes said to Lloyd Briggs in the next 45 seconds. But I didn't need to. I had heard her debrief rooms full of generals. I had watched her reduce a 2-star officer to single syllables in under a minute using nothing but measured, factual language and the weight of what she actually knew. She was not a person who raised her voice. She was a person who made raising your voice feel childish by comparison. What I could see was the effect. Briggs' shoulders dropped. His free hand, which had been resting on the edge of the desk, went flat against the surface. The unconscious movement of someone steadying themselves. The color drained from the side of his face, I could see. He stopped trying to interject after the first attempt, when whatever response he offered was answered with something that made him close his mouth and not open it again. He said, "Yes, ma'am," 3 times. He said, "I understand," once, in the tone of a man who is understanding something he very much wishes he did not understand. Then he handed the phone back to me. "Mara," Stokes said, "I'm sending a JAG liaison from Fort Harlan. ETA 40 minutes. Do not sign anything. Do not agree to anything. Do not leave the building voluntarily. Sit tight. Copy that, Colonel. And Mara." Pause. "I'm sorry this happened." "Thank you, ma'am." The call ended. I set the phone face down on my knee and looked at Lloyd Briggs. He was sitting very still now, the warmth entirely gone from his face, replaced by the expression of a man staring at a door he had just realized locks from the other side. "Your officer," I said quietly, "handled a classified Department of Defense identification credential, a document tied to active national security assets. The moment she picked it up, she triggered a federal protocol. That protocol does not care about your department's internal review process, Captain. It does not care about refresher courses." He opened his mouth. "I'm not finished," I said. He closed it. "I have cameras at my property. Cloud-backed, motion-activated, 4K resolution. Everything that happened in my driveway today is on a server that your department has no jurisdiction over. I would strongly advise you not to contact Officer Vance until the JAG liaison arrives. And I would strongly advise you not to take any action regarding my vehicle or my property in the meantime." I said it calmly. I said it the same way I would have relayed coordinates in the field, not as a threat, but as information. The difference between threatening someone and informing them is the difference between losing your composure and keeping it. I had not lost mine once. Briggs stood. He excused himself. He went into the back. What I didn't know, what I couldn't see from where I was sitting, was what was happening 2 miles away on Birchwood Lane. Cassidy Vance had gone back. She told herself she was conducting a follow-up search. She had a K9 unit with her, a shepherd named Gage, who was good at his job, which was exactly why what Vance was about to do was such an insult to the animal. Gage was trained to find things. He was not trained to pretend to find things. But Vance had something in the front pocket of her uniform that Gage's nose wasn't going to need. A small Ziploc bag, the kind that pharmacies use for prescription samples. Inside it were 11 tablets of oxycodone, 10 milligram, confiscated during a traffic stop 3 weeks earlier, never entered into the evidence log. She had held onto them the way some officers hold onto certain things, as insurance, as an option, as the kind of backup plan you tell yourself you'll never use. She was using it now. She pulled the cruiser to the curb in front of 318 Birchwood Lane. The house was quiet. The Mustang sat exactly as I had left it, hood up, tools on the cloth, late afternoon sun cutting across the chrome in long gold lines. She walked up the driveway. She unclipped Gage's lead. She gave him the command and let him work. He circled the Mustang twice, tail low, nose working the perimeter of the tires, the undercarriage, the door seams. Then he sat down, not alerted, nothing. Vance stood in the driveway for a moment with the particular stillness of someone whose plan has just been rejected by the one participant who had no reason to lie. The neighborhood was quiet. A sprinkler ticked on somewhere down the block. A crow settled on the fence at the edge of the property and watched her with the disinterest of something that has seen everything. She looked at the open car window. She looked at the bag in her pocket. She pulled it out. I wouldn't do that. The voice came from the end of the driveway, and it was not the voice of a neighbor. Vance spun. Standing at the edge of the concrete, where the driveway met the public sidewalk, was a man in a dark navy suit that had been cut with the kind of precision that cost money people in Cedarwood Hills didn't typically spend on lawyers. He was holding a slim briefcase in one hand. In the other, he held nothing because he didn't need to. The woman standing beside him was holding the camera, and the red light on its face was already on, had been on. And the man in the navy suit had the calm, absolute confidence of someone who had spent 30 years walking into situations like this and walking back out with exactly what he came for. My name is Marcus Webb, he said, and even from the distance of 15 feet, his voice carried with the ease of someone accustomed to courtrooms. I represent Mara Calloway. The Channel 9 news crew behind me has been filming for approximately 3 minutes. The footage currently shows a uniformed officer of the Cedarwood Hills Police Department, having deployed a K9 unit that found nothing, now removing an unidentified item from her uniform pocket at the open window of my client's vehicle. He tilted his head slightly. Would you like to tell us what that is, Officer Vance? Vance's hand opened. The bag dropped. It didn't fall inside the car. It landed in the gravel beside the front tire with a sound too small for anyone more than 5 feet away to hear. But the camera was close enough, and its microphone caught it. Vance started. I found this. It was... You removed it from your pocket, the camera operator said, stepping forward slightly. I have it on video. It was already there, Vance said. And even as she said it, something shifted in her voice, the pitch of a story collapsing under its own weight. I was securing it as evidence. Officer Vance, Webb said, his voice dropping, you are on a live broadcast. I'd encourage you to think very carefully about the next sentence. She said nothing. Behind her, from somewhere in the neighborhood, came the sound of a window going up. Then another. A man 2 houses down had come out onto his front porch. A woman across the street stood in her open doorway. And from the upstairs window of the house, 2 doors to the left, Jordan, 16 years old, phone still raised, live now on the same TikTok feed that had been running for the past 4 hours, was capturing everything. That feed had started with the arrest. It had 40,000 views by the time Vance arrived at the station. Within an hour of posting, veterans began appearing in the comments. Someone with the handle VetCore82 wrote, that tattoo on her forearm is a JSOC black unit marker. That is not a gang tattoo. Whoever she is, she has a clearance that would make your head spin. That comment alone was shared 11,000 times. Legal analysts quoted it, journalists screenshot it. Someone with a verified badge from a major news outlet reposted the clip with the caption, who is Mara Calloway, and why did a Cedarwood Hills officer just try to arrest her in her own driveway? By the time Marcus Webb parked his car on Birchwood Lane, the video had crossed 2 million views. The Channel 9 crew had been tipped by their digital desk. They had driven from downtown in under 25 minutes, and now it was all live. Back at the station, the phone at the front desk had been ringing without stop for the better part of an hour. First, local callers, then the mayor's office, then, in the last 15 minutes, two separate voicemails from national producers, one from a cable news network whose name I recognized immediately, one from a digital outlet whose reach I knew was large enough to reshape a narrative in 48 hours. The desk officer was handling it with the controlled expression of someone trying very hard not to communicate how badly things were going. I sat on my bench and watched it all through the narrow window to my left, the one that looked out onto the small parking lot, and just beyond the fence at its edge, the street. A news van had pulled up outside. I could see its satellite dish rising slowly above the roofline like something waking up. Briggs came back into the room twice. The first time he said nothing, just stood in the doorway for a moment looking at me with an expression I had seen before. The expression of someone revising their understanding of a situation they thought they had controlled. The second time, he sat down again, and he looked like a man who had aged a decade in 45 minutes. He was trying to figure out what I was. He still hadn't gotten there. I heard them before I saw them. The front door of the station opened, and there was a shift in the room. A change in the air pressure, the way a room changes when people enter it who are not there to be managed. Two figures in dark suits moved past the front desk without stopping, and behind them came a woman in a charcoal blazer, moving with the unhurried certainty of someone who has every legal right to be exactly where she is and doesn't particularly care whether you agree. She was holding a badge in one hand and a federal warrant in the other. She passed the warrant to the desk officer without breaking stride. She looked around the room until she found Briggs. She did not approach him. "Captain Briggs," she said from across the room, "I'm Special Agent Renata Cruz, FBI, Public Corruption Unit. We'll need access to your server room and your body camera archive from the last 72 hours. We'll also need to speak with Officer Cassidy Vance. Where is she?" Briggs opened his mouth. He had the look of a man trying to find a foothold on a surface that has gone entirely smooth. She was conducting a follow-up at... "She's outside," one of the other agents said, coming through the door. He was leading Vance by the arm. She was not in handcuffs, but she was not in control either. Her face had taken on a stunned quality, like someone who has just emerged from a building that is still on fire behind them and cannot fully process what they're looking at. She saw me. I was sitting exactly where I had been sitting when Briggs first walked in. Same posture, same stillness. I had not moved from that bench in 2 hours. I looked at her for a moment. I did not look at her with anger, because anger would have cost me something I wasn't willing to spend. I looked at her the way you look at a problem that has just been resolved, with a sort of exhausted clarity and something that might have been, on the very edge of it, pity. She was 24 years old. She had made a choice today that was going to follow her for the rest of her life, and she still didn't fully understand it. That was the thing about people who had never been held accountable. They never believed, right up until the moment the walls moved, that the walls could move. Cruz's team fanned out through the station with a quiet efficiency I recognized. The kind of movement that comes from doing a thing so many times it has become reflexive. Two agents went to the server room. One stationed himself near the door. Cruz herself pulled out a chair and sat across from Briggs at a table near the back, set down her notepad, and looked at him with the calm attention of someone who has a great deal of time and every reason to use it carefully. Vance was directed to a separate room. The station, which had been humming with the low-grade stress of a bad afternoon, went very, very quiet. I exhaled. Not a sigh, not relief exactly, not yet. Something quieter than that. Something closer to the particular exhale that happens after a sustained period of holding yourself completely together, when the immediate danger has shifted from your hands into someone else's and you allow yourself, just for a single breath, to let the tension in your chest go slack. I looked out through the window at the parking lot. The news van was still there. Cruz's black SUVs were parked at angles across two spaces, unhurried, claiming exactly as much room as they needed. Marcus Webb's car, I recognized it from the feed I had been quietly watching on my phone for the past 20 minutes, was not yet here, but it would be. Everything I had started in that driveway was still running. I hadn't stopped it. I hadn't panicked. I hadn't given them a single frame of footage they could use to flip the narrative. I had sat on a bench in a beige room and made one phone call, and I had let the weight of what I actually was, not what Cassidy Vance had decided I was, but what I actually was, do its work. Because here is something I learned in 5 years of operating in places where the consequences of being wrong are permanent and immediate. You do not fight every battle with force. Some battles you win by refusing to be what your enemy needs you to be. You stay still, you stay precise, you stay yourself, and you let the truth be heavy enough to do the work. Agent Cruz looked up from her notepad and across the room until she found me. She nodded once, professional, brief, the nod of a peer, not a subordinate, and not a victim. I nodded back. The walls of the Cedarwood Hills Police Department were still standing, but everything inside them was already beginning to come apart. And the worst thing Lloyd Briggs was about to discover, the thing that would keep him awake for every night between now and sentencing, was that it had been coming apart long before today, long before my driveway, long before Cassidy Vance decided that a black woman with grease on her hands couldn't possibly belong in a house that nice. He had built something rotten, and I had simply been the first person to walk into it who had the tools to take it down from the inside. What none of us knew yet was how deep it went. That part was still coming. If you've been watching this from the beginning, comment below and tell me what would you have done in that station. And if you want to see what the FBI found when they started pulling the records, stay right here, subscribe. Part 3 is where everything breaks open. They released me at 7:14 p.m. I know the exact time because I looked at my phone the moment Agent Cruz's assistant handed me a release form to sign. And the timestamp on the screen was the first thing my eyes landed on. 7 hours. That was how long I had been inside the Cedarwood Hills Police Department. 7 hours since Cassidy Vance put her hands on me in my own driveway, and now here I was, standing at the top of the station steps in the last of the evening light, signing a document that said in careful legal language that I was free to go. I signed it without reading it. Marcus Webb, standing 2 feet to my right, had already read it twice. The air outside hit differently than I expected, not because it was particularly clean or particularly cool. It was a summer evening in a mid-Atlantic suburb, heavy and faintly sweet with cut grass and someone's charcoal grill down the block. But after 7 hours of recycled fluorescent air and the particular staleness of a building where nothing moves freely, it landed on my skin like a physical thing. I stood at the top of those steps and breathed it in and said nothing for a moment. Below us, the parking lot had become a controlled circus. 3 news vans were parked along the perimeter fence. 2 reporters were doing live stand-ups, positioned so that the station entrance appeared over their shoulders. A small crowd of residents had gathered beyond the media barrier. People I didn't recognize, people from other streets in Cedarwood Hills, and from the neighborhoods just beyond it, people who had apparently been following Jordan's feed all afternoon and had driven here because they needed to see the building in person. A few of them were holding phones. A few held handwritten signs. One of them read, "We see you, Mara." I had no idea how they knew my name. Webb, reading my expression, said quietly, "Jordan tagged you in the post 6 hours ago. You have 230,000 followers on a platform you haven't used in 3 years." I looked at him. "The account came up in a photo someone found from a unit commendation ceremony in 2019, he said. "The internet found you before I did." That was how this had begun. With a teenager's camera and a comment section full of veterans who recognized a tattoo. And somehow it had become this. A crowd outside a police station at dusk. Camera lights on the steps. My name on a handwritten sign held by someone I had never met. I pulled my jacket tighter and walked down the steps. Webb fell in beside me. And as we moved toward his car, he began to debrief me in the quiet, methodical way of someone who has processed a great deal of information and is now choosing the sequence of delivery carefully. What he told me on that walk from the station, steps to his vehicle, 3 minutes, maybe 4, rearranged everything I thought I understood about the afternoon. It had not just been about me. That was the thing I had not fully grasped while I was sitting in that processing room making phone calls and watching Briggs's face change colors. I had understood that what had happened in my driveway was not an accident. I had understood that Vance operated the way she operated because the culture of the department allowed and encouraged it. But I had not yet understood the full architecture of what Lloyd Briggs had built, what that culture had been constructed to protect, and for how long. In the 30 months prior to that Tuesday afternoon, Cassidy Vance had conducted 38 targeted vehicle and pedestrian stops in Cedarwood Hills and the adjacent neighborhood of Millbrook Heights. 38. Of those, 22 had resulted in property seizure. Vehicles, cash, electronics, jewelry, conducted under a civil asset forfeiture statutes that allowed law enforcement to take property suspected of being connected to criminal activity, sometimes without ever filing a charge against the owner. No charge required, no conviction required, just suspicion and a form, and a captain willing to sign it. Briggs had been signing those forms for 2.5 years. The vehicles that were seized went to impound. From impound, they moved to a private auction company, one that Briggs had personally recommended to the city 3 years ago, citing competitive rates and efficient processing. What he had not mentioned was that the auction company was co-owned by his brother-in-law, a man named Derek Pollard, who had a history of buying seized vehicles at a fraction of their assessed value and reselling them through a network of dealerships in 3 states. A 2021 Range Rover, seized from a Millbrook Heights resident who was never charged with anything, had been auctioned to Pollard's company for $800. It resold 11 weeks later for $31,000. A Lexus that belonged to a retired school teacher, a woman who had made the mistake of driving through a checkpoint van set up on a Friday evening, sold through the same channel for $600. It had been worth $22,000. And then there was my Mustang, fully restored, mechanically sound, recently valued by a classic car appraiser at $62,000. When Cassidy Vance turned onto Birchwood Lane and saw that car sitting in the driveway of 318, she had not just seen a suspicious person. She had seen an opportunity worth more than she made in a year. She had seen a score. Everything that followed, the escalation, the arrest, the planted pills, all of it, was the machinery of a scheme that had been running long enough that it had become routine. The only thing that had not been routine was me. Webb's car pulled away from the station. He drove with one hand, the other holding his phone flat on the console so I could read from the screen as he scrolled. The FBI had pulled Briggs's property seizure logs. They had cross-referenced them with the auction company's transaction records. They had found the discrepancies within the first 2 hours of having server access, not because Briggs had been sloppy, but because the paper trail he had constructed, though careful, had not been constructed to withstand scrutiny from people with federal subpoena power and a forensic accountant on call. Vance, for her part, had not lasted long in the interrogation room. Cruz had told me this herself in a brief conversation outside the station while Webb finished the paperwork. She described it without satisfaction, flatly, professionally, the way you describe the outcome of a process that went as expected. Vance had asked for a lawyer within the first 10 minutes. The lawyer had arrived, conferred with her, and had apparently given her the kind of advice that only makes sense when the evidence against you is both irrefutable and being broadcast on cable news. Talk first, talk completely, and talk before your superior does. Vance talked. She named Briggs. She described the system step by step, the pre-selected zones, the profile of vehicle that triggered a stop, the signal from Briggs when a seizure was worth pursuing versus when it should be documented as a warning and let go. She described the unlogged evidence she had carried in her pocket for 3 weeks. And she described specifically the moment she stood in my driveway and looked at the Mustang and made a calculation that she had made dozens of times before, the same calculation that had always worked out. She had not known about the cloud-backed security system. The cameras at 318 Birchwood Lane, a system I had installed in my first week of renting, partly from habit, partly because certain things you do not stop doing just because you are no longer in the field, had captured everything in 4K resolution on a server she had no way of reaching and no authority to access. The angle from the porch camera covered the full length of the driveway and most of the street. The angle from the garage motion sensor covered the car itself and the first 20 feet of approach. Together, they had recorded every second of the encounter from the moment Vance's patrol car rolled to the curb. Cruz's team had accessed the footage remotely using credentials I provided, and they had watched it in the station's conference room. Webb told me later that the room had gone completely silent during the 12-minute clip in which Vance ran the plates, heard the confirmation come back as my name and my address, paused, and then continued the arrest anyway. There was no ambiguity. There was no communication gap. There was no split-second decision made in genuine uncertainty. She had known. She had known the entire time, and she had kept going. I did not watch the footage that night. I had already lived it. I didn't need to watch it again. What I did watch late that evening, sitting at the kitchen table in 318 Birchwood Lane with a glass of water and my phone propped against a fruit bowl, was the news coverage, not out of vanity, out of a soldier's habit of tracking the full scope of a situation. You don't stop monitoring a battlefield just because your immediate position is secure. You scan outward, you understand the terrain. The terrain had shifted dramatically. Jordan's original video was at 9 million views and climbing. The comment section had become a living document of the community's reaction. Veterans, lawyers, former residents of Cedarwood Hills, people who had been stopped by Vance on those Friday evening checkpoints and had never reported it because they didn't believe anyone would listen. A woman named Denise Hartwell had posted a 60-second video from her living room explaining that 18 months ago, Vance had confiscated her husband's truck during a traffic stop on the grounds of suspected narcotics, and that the truck had never been returned, and that her husband had never been charged with anything, and that no one at the department had returned a single one of their calls. Her video had 3 million views by midnight. 12 individuals ultimately came forward in the first 48 hours. 12 people from Cedarwood Hills and Millbrook Heights, every one of them black, every one of them with a story that rhymed with mine. Stopped for nothing, given a reason that didn't hold up, separated from property they never got back. An elderly man who lost a car he had owned for 20 years. A college student who had her laptop and camera equipment confiscated during a stop on her way home from a freelance shoot. A couple who lost $3,800 in cash they had withdrawn to pay a contractor and were driving with cash that Briggs's department called suspicious funds and never logged. 12 people, 24 months, and those were just the ones who trusted that this time someone would listen. I thought about that number a lot in the days that followed. 3 nights after my release, Marcus Webb came to the house with a timeline printed out on 6 sheets of paper. We sat at the kitchen table, the same glass of water, different hour. And he walked me through what the FBI investigation had found and what the civil litigation was going to look like. He was thorough and precise, which I appreciated. He did not try to soften anything, which I appreciated more. When he was done, I asked him about Peggy Dunmore. He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "She's been in the news." I already knew she had. Channel 9 had run a segment 2 days after the arrest identifying her as the caller, about, not maliciously, but factually, the way journalism sometimes does things that have malicious effects through no particular intent of their own. Her daughter had called her from college, apparently, and the conversation had not gone well. Peggy had stopped answering her door. There was a photo circulating online of her standing at her window, the same window she had stood at when she watched me work on the Mustang. And it was the kind of photograph that tells a whole story in a single frame. I am not going to tell you I felt nothing when I heard about Peggy Dunmore. That would be dishonest. I felt something, not satisfaction, and not quite sympathy either. Something more complicated. The thing about Peggy was that she had not been the villain of this story, not really. She had been the mechanism. She had been the convenient door through which Vance had entered, and she had been used as freely and as casually as everything else Briggs's department had used, including the law, including the badge, including the trust of every resident who had ever felt safer because there was a patrol car on their street. She had looked at me and seen something that didn't belong, and she had picked up the phone, and that action had cost her in ways she hadn't imagined. I understood something about that, about the gap between the story you tell yourself and the story you are actually living, about what it feels like when those two things collide hard enough to shatter one of them. I did not call her. I did not seek her out. But I also did not join the chorus of people online who wanted her condemned. She was a 71-year-old woman who had let prejudice make a decision for her, and that decision had set off a chain of events that had already resulted in 2 arrests and a federal investigation. The consequence was proportionate. It did not need my help. Marcus Webb, after a careful pause, told me that Peggy had put her house on the market. I nodded. I said nothing. 4 days after my release, I gave one interview. Not a press conference, Not a sit down with a major network, a single conversation with a reporter from a mid sized independent outlet whose work I had read and respected. A reporter named Angela Torres, who had been covering civil rights and law enforcement for 11 years, and who had the specific gift of knowing when to stop asking questions and let a person's words fill the space. We sat on the porch of 318 Birchwood Lane. The Mustang was in the garage. The tools were back on the shelf. I had not touched the car since the arrest, not out of fear, not out of avoidance, but because certain things you say for when the moment is right. And that moment had not arrived yet. Angela asked me one question that I keep coming back to, even now. She asked, "When you were sitting in that patrol car, what were you thinking?" And I told her the truth. "I was thinking about discipline," I said. "I've been in a situation where losing control was the easiest thing in the world to do, where everything in your body is telling you to react, to fight back, to match the energy of what's being done to you. And every time, the people who survived those situations really survived them, not just got out alive, but came out intact, were the ones who found a way to stay in their own lane, to not give the chaos what it needed from them." I paused. Cassidy Vance needed me to be afraid. She needed me to be angry. She needed me to do something that would shift the story from what she was doing to what I was doing. And I didn't give her that. I gave her nothing but the truth. And the truth turned out to be enough. Angela Torres published the interview the next morning. It was read 2 million times in the first 6 hours. I know because Marcus Webb texted me, the link with a number attached to it, and then 20 minutes later texted me again with a different number. "Settlement offer," the second text read. "City Council authorized $4.5 million. They want resolution before the civil trial. Before this gets any bigger." I sat with my phone in my hand for a long time. I thought about Denise Hartwell's 60-second video. I thought about the elderly man and his 20-year-old car. I thought about the college student's camera equipment, which had been someone's investment in a future, confiscated and sold off by people who saw everything that wasn't theirs as something that could be. I thought about 12 names, 12 stories, 12 people who had been through the same door I had walked through, without any of the assets that had made it possible for me to walk back out. The $4.5 million they were offering me was not going to undo any of that. It was not going to give anyone back the years they had spent trying to recover what Briggs's machine had taken from them. But money, directed carefully, could build something. It could fund something that meant that the next person, the next woman on her own driveway, the next man pulled over on a Friday evening, the next family sitting across from a captain who offered them nothing and expected them to take it, had somewhere to turn, had a number to call, had a Marcus Webb of their own. I typed back 2 words, not enough. Then I set the phone down. I went to the kitchen. I poured a glass of water. I stood at the window that looked out onto the street, the same houses, the same summer evening light that had been there every day since April, steady and ordinary and completely indifferent to everything that had happened in it. The Mustang was waiting in the garage. The story was not done, but it was moving exactly the way I needed it to move. On my terms, at my pace, towards something that wasn't just about me. That had never been the point. 12 people, 12 stories, one corrupt machine that thought it was untouchable. If this hits you somewhere real, share it. Let someone else know this happened. And subscribe, because part 4 is where the truth about who I really am finally comes out. You are not going to see it coming. 6 weeks after the arrest, I sat in the back row of a federal courtroom and watched a judge tell Cassidy Vance exactly what she had always been. I had not taken a seat near the front. I had not dressed for cameras. I was wearing a plain gray blazer, dark slacks, and the same steel-toed boots I had been wearing the afternoon this started. A choice that was partly deliberate and partly just because they were the most comfortable shoes I owned. Marcus Webb had offered to sit beside me. I told him to sit with the other victims' families, where he was more needed. He gave me a long look and didn't argue. That was one of the things I appreciated about Webb. He knew when a person had already made up their mind. The courtroom was full, not loud. Full, there is a difference. A loud room has energy that moves in circles, restless and unresolved. This room had the density of something about to be settled. The 12 individuals who had come forward after Jordan's video, along with their family members, occupied the left side of the gallery in rows that had filled before 9 in the morning. Reporters sat in the press section with the particular contained alertness of people who have already written the headline and are now waiting for the event to confirm it. Agent Cruz was near the aisle, notepad closed, hands folded. The judge, a woman named the Honorable Patricia Wren, 61 years old, with a reputation that several attorneys had described to Webb as constitutionally allergic to nonsense, had listened to closing arguments the previous day with an expression of sustained professional impassivity. She had taken no visible notes during the defense's presentation. She had taken several during the prosecution's. Cassidy Vance sat at the defense table in a suit that didn't fit quite right. Something borrowed, something that belonged to a version of her she was trying to perform for the room. She had aged since the arrest, not dramatically, not the way people age in movies, but in the small ways that sustained fear ages a person from the inside out. Something pinched around the mouth, something that had gone out of her eyes. The confidence that had walked up my driveway on that Tuesday afternoon was gone, replaced by the raw, exposed quality of someone who has run out of surfaces to hide behind. She did not look at the gallery. She did not look at me. Judge Wren looked at her for a long time before she spoke. Officer Vance, she began, and even the title sounded like a correction. Something said precisely to demonstrate that the word no longer fit the person it was attached to. I have reviewed the totality of the evidence in this case. I have reviewed the body camera footage, the property seizure records, the surveillance footage from the defendant's own home, and the recorded confession in which you described in your own words a pattern of conduct that you understood to be predatory at the time you were conducting it. She paused. You did not misunderstand what you were doing. You knew. The evidence makes that indisputably clear. The room was so quiet I could hear the ventilation system in the ceiling. You are not a police officer who made a terrible mistake, Wren continued, her voice carrying the weight of a verdict long since formed. You are a person who used a police officer's authority as a cover for theft, racial targeting, and the deliberate fabrication of evidence against a citizen in her own home. That is not a mistake. That is a choice. And it is the kind of choice that this court takes with the utmost seriousness. Another pause. Cassidy Vance, this court sentences you to 12 years in federal custody. The left side of the gallery did not cheer. I had half expected them to. Had braced for it, in fact, because I understand why people cheer in moments like this. And I did not want to feel superior to anyone for needing the release of it. But the room held. What came instead was something quieter and more durable. A collective exhale, a release of something that had been held in the chest of every person in that gallery for months, some of them for years. The sound of people who had been waiting a long time to be told that what happened to them was real, and that it mattered, and that the people who did it were going to be accountable for it. Lloyd Briggs was sentenced 4 days later in a proceeding that took less than 90 minutes. He had negotiated a plea the week before, not out of remorse, Webb told me, but out of the particular pragmatism of a man who had spent 30 years calculating angles and finally ran out of them. 20 years, federal, non-negotiable. The Cedarwood Hills Police Department was formally dissolved by the City Council the same afternoon, pending a Department of Justice review that would extend to 3 neighboring precincts. Derek Pollard, Briggs' brother-in-law, was indicted on separate charges of fraud and money laundering. The auction company's records were subpoenaed. It was going to take years to fully unwind, but it was unwinding. I was not there for Briggs's sentencing. I watched it on my phone, sitting in the garage at 318 Birchwood Lane, with the Mustang's hood up and a wrench in my hand. I had gone back to work on the car the morning after Vance's verdict, not because the story was finished, but because I had been waiting for the right moment. And the moment had come. Some things you hold until you know it's safe to hold them again. The Mustang was one of those things. What I had not known, what none of us in that courtroom had known on the morning of Vance's sentencing, was that a different kind of reckoning was still coming. One that had nothing to do with the legal proceedings. One that I had no advance warning of and no control over. And that, when it arrived, hit the way certain things hit when you have spent years keeping them private, all at once, and from a direction you weren't watching. It came on a Friday morning, 9 days after the trial. Governor Sandra Ellison held a press conference at the state capitol. It had been announced the day before as a statement on law enforcement reform, the kind of scheduled political event that generates coverage in proportion to the specific things said rather than the fact of its occurrence. I was not watching it live. I learned about it the way most people learn about things that are said publicly about them, without their foreknowledge, from a phone that would not stop vibrating. Webb called first, then my former commanding officer, then a number I didn't recognize, which I let go to voicemail, then two more unknown numbers, then Webb again. I set down the wrench. I wiped my hands. I pulled up the live stream of the press conference on my phone, already 12 minutes in, and I found the moment. Governor Ellison was standing at a podium in a dark blazer, her posture upright and controlled in the way of someone who has spent years learning to hold themselves steady in public. But her voice, when I found it, was not entirely steady. It had the quality of something being managed rather than something that had never needed managing. I want to address, she said, something that the public does not yet know about the woman at the center of what happened in Cedarwood Hills. I do this with her knowledge and her consent. She glanced briefly at a sheet of paper, then looked back up. 6 years ago, my son, who was working as a freelance journalist in Afghanistan, was taken hostage by insurgents in Paktia province. The State Department assessed the situation and determined that a rescue operation was not viable. The terrain was too remote. The intelligence was insufficient. Her jaw tightened slightly. I was told to prepare for the worst. I sat down on a paint bucket in the middle of the garage. I don't think I consciously decided to sit. My legs just found a different relationship with gravity. A joint Special Operations Command unit entered Paktia province regardless. The governor continued. They walked 26 miles through mountain terrain in deteriorating weather. They encountered an armed force 3 times their number, and they brought my son home. Her voice dropped just slightly. The team leader, the person responsible for the plan, for the execution, and for the decision to keep moving when every rational calculation said to turn back, was a 21-year-old sergeant named Mara Calloway. The press pool went audible. I heard cameras, questions, the specific rustle of a room, reconfiguring its understanding of a story it thought it had already fully grasped. During the extraction, Ellison continued, and now she did not look at the paper at all. Sergeant Calloway sustained shrapnel injuries to her right side. She carried my son the final 4 miles to the extraction point on her back. She did not stop. She did not ask for relief. She got him out. I remembered that night. I remembered it the way you remember things that happen when your body has exceeded its normal range and your mind has detached itself slightly from the immediate reality of what you are doing in order to continue doing it. I remembered the weight of him, not as a burden exactly, but as a responsibility that had a specific gravity, a specific cost with each step. I remembered the cold. I remembered the particular color of the sky in that part of the world at that hour, a blue so dark it looked like something solid pressing down. I remembered thinking very clearly, one step and then one more, and then one more after that. The same thought repeated until there were no more steps needed. I had not talked about that night to anyone who wasn't in that unit. I had signed documents that ensured I wouldn't. The governor, I learned later, had gone through a specific protocol to receive clearance, to disclose what she disclosed, because she had decided, as she put it in the press conference, that silence was no longer something she could maintain in good conscience. The woman who carried my son home, Ellison said, was handcuffed in her own driveway and framed for crimes she did not commit by officers who decided, based entirely on what she looked like, that she did not belong in the neighborhood where she lived. I want this country to sit with that for a moment. I want every person watching this to really sit with it. She looked directly into the camera. Mara Calloway is not a symbol. She is a person who served this country in ways most of us will never know and never be asked to match. And she was still not safe in her own driveway. That is the reality we are living in, and it has to change. The press conference generated the kind of coverage that moves faster than any deliberate publicity campaign could, because it had the one quality that no publicist can manufacture. It was completely unexpected. By noon, Mara Calloway and Ghost of Paktia, a nickname that surfaced from the veteran community online, were the top 2 trending terms nationally. By evening, journalists were running profiles assembled from the handful of things that were not classified. The commendation ceremony photo from 2019, 2 sentences in a congressional record about JSOC operations in the Eastern Theater, the interview I had given Angela Torres on my porch, which was now being watched by an audience tens of times larger than the one it had first reached. The GoFundMe that Marcus Webb's team had established for the Legal Defense Fund, the fund I had insisted on as a condition of the settlement, the fund built to serve every person Briggs' machine had ever targeted, crossed $5 million before midnight. People donated in amounts ranging from $5 to $5,000. Veterans donated, law students donated. A retired judge in Ohio donated $300 and left a comment that said only, "Justice takes too long. This is the least I can do to help it move." In the county jail, Cassidy Vance watched the press conference on a shared television in the common area. I know this because it was later described to me by Webb, who had been told by one of Cruz's contacts. She had been sitting alone at a metal table when the governor began to speak. By the time Ellison finished, Vance had put her head in her hands. The other women in the room, some of whom, it turned out, had personal histories with the Cedarwood Hills Police Department, were watching her with the particular, dispassionate attention of people who have been waiting for someone to understand something that they understood a long time ago. I did not watch the press conference coverage that evening. I had seen enough. I went to the garage instead. I closed the door behind me. I stood for a moment in the quiet of that space, the oil smell, the half-light from the work lamp, the specific stillness of a room that has been used and is waiting to be used again. And I felt something that I do not have a precise word for. Not triumph, not relief. Something older and less dramatic than either of those things. Something that sits in the body the way certain kinds of tiredness sit. Not unpleasant, not without weight, but earned. Specifically and completely earned. I picked up the wrench from where I had left it. I worked for 2 hours without stopping. I had been closed before the arrest, closer than I had let myself fully admit. The final adjustments took less time than I expected. When I was done, I stood back and looked at the car the way you look at something you have built from a worse version of itself into the best version it is capable of being. The Highland green paint, which I had spent 6 weeks correcting back to its original depth, caught the work lamp's light and held it. Every chrome edge was sharp. Every line was where it was supposed to be. I wiped my hands. I put the wrench on the shelf. I opened the garage door. Outside, Birchwood Lane was quiet. Not the held breath quiet of the afternoon Vance arrived. A different kind. The organic quiet of a summer evening settling into night. Crickets starting up somewhere near the fence line. A light on in the house across the street where new neighbors had moved in last week. The for sale sign that had stood in Peggy Dunmore's yard was gone, replaced by a small potted plant on the front step that belonged to whoever came next. I opened the Mustang's door. I slid in behind the wheel. The leather was warm from the work lamp. I gripped the wheel with both hands and looked through the windshield at the open mouth of the garage door and the dark lane beyond it. And I thought, briefly, the way you think things that don't need to be thought about for very long. About everything it had taken to sit in this exact seat at this exact moment. The years, the mountains, the driveway, the bench in the beige room, the 12 people in the left side of the gallery. One small, careful exhale. I put the key in the ignition. I turned it. The engine caught, not with a starter's cough, not with the uncertain hesitation of a machine that has been sitting too long, but cleanly, directly, with a deep and immediate authority that I felt in my chest before I heard it fully through my ears. A sound like something waking from a long sleep, and knowing exactly what it is. I backed out of the garage slowly, shifted into drive, and moved down Birchwood Lane toward the intersection at the end of the block. The streetlights were on. The road ahead was open in both directions. I turned left, not because I had a destination, but because the road went on in that direction for a very long time, and I had earned the distance. Here is what I want to leave you with. They came for me because of what they assumed from the outside. They looked at me and built a story around what they thought they saw. And they were so certain of that story that they were willing to break the law to make it stick. What they could not factor in, what people like Vance and Briggs can never factor in because their whole system depends on not seeing it, is what is underneath the surface of the people they decide to underestimate. They reached for something they thought would be easy to take, and they found out it wasn't. I'm not telling you this because I want you to feel sorry for me. I'm telling you because I want you to understand something about what discipline actually means, and not the discipline of following rules, but the discipline of knowing who you are so completely, so absolutely, that no one else's story about you has room to take hold. When Cassidy Vance put those handcuffs on me, she was trying to write a story about who I was. I refused to live in it. I had my own story, and I stayed inside it, and in the end, the truth of it was larger than anything she tried to build around me. That is what I want you to take from this, not the verdict, not the sentencing, not the millions raised or the department dissolved or the governor's press conference. Those are outcomes. They matter, but outcomes are what happens when someone refuses to be defined by what other people decide they are. The refusal comes first. It always does. If this story meant something to you, share it, tell someone. And if you've ever refused to let someone else's story about you become the one you lived in, comment below. I want to hear from you. Subscribe, because there is always more to tell.